On July 20th, 1944, a briefcase bomb exploded just feet away from Adolf Hitler during a military conference. The Führer survived with minor injuries, but the conspirators behind the plot would face consequences so severe that their names would be etched into history as both heroes and cautionary tales. But what exactly happened to those who dared to challenge the most heavily guarded man in Nazi Germany? The fates that awaited these would-be assassins reveal a pattern of brutality that extended far beyond the individuals themselves, reaching into their families, their associates, and anyone remotely connected to their cause. Today, we'll uncover the disturbing fates of those who tried to end Hitler's life and discover how their courage came at the ultimate price. Before we examine the most famous plots, we need to understand how Hitler's regime dealt with early assassination attempts, as these established the template for the horrific punishments that would follow. In 1921, long before Hitler's rise to absolute power, a group of political opponents attempted to disrupt one of his speeches in Munich. While not technically an assassination attempt, Hitler's violent response to this early challenge foreshadowed what was to come. The perpetrators were beaten by Nazi brown shirts, and several were hospitalized with severe injuries. Even in these early days, Hitler understood that mercy was weakness, and that brutal retaliation would deter future attempts. The first serious assassination attempt came in 1932, when a communist named Ludwig Assmann planned to kill Hitler during a political rally in Berlin. Assmann was arrested before he could carry out his plan, but his interrogation revealed the extent of Hitler's growing paranoia about security. Rather than a quick execution, Assmann was subjected to months of torture in a makeshift prison before finally dying from his injuries. His family members were also arrested, with his brother disappearing entirely from official records. This early incident established what would become Hitler's standard response, not just the elimination of the would-be assassin, but the systematic destruction of everyone connected to them. The message was clear. Challenging Hitler didn't just risk your own life, but the lives of everyone you loved. As Hitler consolidated power in 1933, another attempt emerged from within his own ranks. A disgruntled SA member named Klaus Weber grew disillusioned with the party's direction and began planning Hitler's elimination during a party function. Weber's plot was discovered before execution, but his fate demonstrated how Hitler dealt with betrayal from within. Weber wasn't simply shot or hanged. Instead, he was subjected to what Nazi officials called enhanced interrogation for weeks, forced to reveal every detail of his plan and every person he had spoken to about his doubts. Weber's eventual death was almost a mercy, but the ripple effects continued. His wife was sent to a concentration camp, his children were placed in Nazi re-education facilities, and his elderly parents lost their home and pension. This collective punishment strategy would become Hitler's signature response to assassination attempts. But these early incidents were just the beginning. As Hitler's power grew and his enemies became more sophisticated, so too did the severity of punishments for those who dared to challenge him. The stage was set for even more elaborate plots, and correspondingly, more horrific consequences. November 8th, 1939. The Burger Bräukeller in Munich was packed with Nazi officials celebrating the anniversary of Hitler's failed beer hall putsch. Hidden within a pillar behind the speaker's podium, a bomb ticked away, carefully timed to explode during Hitler's annual commemorative speech. The man responsible for this elaborate plot was Georg Elser, a simple carpenter whose story would become one of the most remarkable tales of individual resistance against the Nazi regime. Elser spent months preparing for this moment. Working alone, he had infiltrated the beer hall over 30 times, secretly hollowing out the pillar and installing his explosive device. His plan was nearly perfect, except for one crucial miscalculation. Hitler left the event 13 minutes early due to fog that grounded his planned flight back to Berlin. The explosion killed 8 people and injured over 60, but Hitler was already miles away. The blast was so powerful that it brought down part of the ceiling and left a crater where the podium had stood. Had Hitler maintained his usual schedule, the course of World War II might have been dramatically different. Elser was arrested at the Swiss border just hours after the explosion, and his capture marked the beginning of one of the most prolonged and systematic torture campaigns in Nazi history. Rather than executing him immediately, Hitler ordered that Elser be kept alive for detailed interrogation. The Führer was obsessed with understanding how a lone carpenter could come so close to ending his life. For weeks, Elser endured daily interrogation sessions that grew increasingly brutal. His interrogators, led by Heinrich Müller of the Gestapo, employed techniques designed not just to extract information, but to break Elser's spirit completely. They wanted to understand his motivations, his methods, and most importantly, whether he had accomplices. Despite the torture, Elser maintained that he had acted alone, motivated by his opposition to the war and his belief that removing Hitler would save countless lives. His interrogators found this impossible to believe. How could a simple tradesman execute such a sophisticated plot without foreign assistance or high-level conspiracy? The torture intensified. Elser was subjected to what the Nazis called sharpened interrogation, involving techniques that left permanent physical damage. His fingers were broken to prevent him from demonstrating his bomb-making techniques. His feet were beaten until he could barely walk. Still, he maintained his story of acting alone. Frustrated by their inability to break Elser completely, the Nazis developed a different strategy. Rather than executing him, they decided to keep him as a potential propaganda tool. He was transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, then later to Dachau, where he was held in special isolation. For over 5 years, Elser lived in a strange limbo. He was neither executed nor released, but kept in solitary confinement, while the Nazis occasionally brought him out for renewed interrogation attempts. His physical condition deteriorated dramatically during these years, as guards were instructed to provide minimal food and medical care. The end came in April 1945, as Allied forces approached Dachau. With the war clearly lost, Hitler finally ordered Elser's execution. On April 9, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, Georg Elser was shot by his guards. His body was immediately cremated to prevent any potential martyrdom. But Elser's story doesn't end with his death. The Nazi investigation into his background had devastating consequences for everyone who knew him. His family members were arrested and interrogated. His former girlfriend was sent to a concentration camp. Even casual acquaintances found themselves under suspicion. The village where Elser grew up became the subject of intense Gestapo scrutiny. Neighbors were questioned about his character, his political views, and his activities in the months before the bombing. Several villagers were arrested simply for having expressed anti-war sentiments in Elser's presence. His sister Maria was particularly targeted. Despite having no knowledge of her brother's plans, she was arrested and held for months while investigators tried to prove her complicity. She was eventually released, but remained under surveillance for the remainder of the war. The investigation also revealed the extent of Nazi paranoia about internal threats. Every carpenter in the Munich area was questioned about their recent work. Every person who had purchased materials similar to those used in Elser's bomb faced interrogation. The ripple effects of his lone action continued for years, yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of Elser's fate was how close he came to success. Modern analysis of his bomb design shows that it was remarkably sophisticated for a self-taught carpenter. Had Hitler not left early, Elser's name would be remembered as the man who changed the course of history. Instead, his story serves as a testament to both individual courage and the brutal consequences of challenging tyranny. His fate would pale in comparison to what awaited the conspirators of July 20th, 1944, whose elaborate military plot would trigger the most extensive purge in Nazi history. The briefcase bomb that exploded at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters on July 20th, 1944, represented the culmination of years of military conspiracy against the Nazi regime. Led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and involving hundreds of high-ranking officers, Operation Valkyrie was the most sophisticated assassination attempt Hitler would face. Its failure triggered a wave of retribution so extensive that it effectively decapitated the German military leadership. Stauffenberg had positioned his briefcase containing a plastic explosive just feet from Hitler during a military conference. The blast killed 4 people and injured many others, but Hitler survived with relatively minor injuries. Within hours, the conspiracy began to unravel as the plotters realized their target was still alive. The immediate aftermath was swift and brutal. Stauffenberg, along with his co-conspirators Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, Werner von Haeften, and Friedrich Olbrecht, were arrested within hours of the failed coup attempt. By midnight on July 20th, they faced a hastily convened court-martial in the courtyard of the Bendler Block military headquarters in Berlin. The proceedings were a mockery of military justice. No proper defense was allowed, no witnesses were called, and the verdict was predetermined. All 4 men were sentenced to death by firing squad. But even in these final moments, the Nazi regime's cruelty was evident. The execution was deliberately botched to increase suffering. Stauffenberg was forced to watch his co-conspirators die before facing the firing squad himself, shouting, "Long live our sacred Germany," as the shots rang out. Their bodies were immediately buried in unmarked graves, but this was only the beginning of the Nazi response. Hitler, enraged by how close the plot had come to success, ordered what he called the greatest manhunt in German history. The investigation, led by the Gestapo under Heinrich Himmler, would eventually encompass over 7,000 arrests. The scope of the purge was unprecedented. Unlike previous assassination attempts that focused primarily on the actual perpetrators, the July 20th investigation cast an impossibly wide net. Anyone who had ever expressed doubt about the war, anyone who had been critical of Nazi policies, anyone remotely connected to the conspirators faced potential arrest. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, found himself implicated despite having only peripheral knowledge of the plot. Rather than face a public trial that might damage his reputation as a war hero, Rommel was given a choice: a trial for treason that would result in his family's persecution, or a quiet death by poison with the promise that his family would be left alone. On October 14, 1944, Rommel took the poison and was buried with full military honors. The official cause of death listed as complications from his earlier war injuries. General Ludwig Beck, former chief of the German General Staff, had been designated as the head of state in the post-Hitler government. When the plot failed, Beck attempted to take his own life with a pistol, but the wound was not fatal. In a scene of remarkable cruelty, a Gestapo officer finished the job with a second shot, denying Beck even the dignity of determining his own end. The fate of General Friedrich Fromm illustrated the paranoid atmosphere that followed July 20th. Fromm had actually ordered the immediate execution of Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators, possibly to cover up his own knowledge of the plot. Despite this apparent loyalty, Fromm was arrested, tried, and executed in March 1945. In Hitler's mind, anyone who had been in a position to know about the conspiracy and failed to report it was guilty of treason. But the most horrific fates were reserved for those tried before the People's Court under Judge Roland Freisler. These proceedings were less trials than theatrical performances designed to humiliate the defendants before their execution. The conspirators were deliberately dressed in ill-fitting clothes, denied belts so their pants would fall down, and subjected to screaming tirades from Freisler. General Henning von Treschow, one of the plot's key organizers, anticipated his fate and chose to end his own life before capture. On July 21st, he walked into a field near the Eastern Front and detonated a hand grenade. His final words to a fellow officer were a prophecy about the conspiracy's ultimate vindication. The attempt had to be made regardless of consequences, because history would judge them. The family members of conspirators faced systematic persecution. Stauffenberg's wife, Nina, was arrested along with their 4 children, including a baby born after his execution. They were imprisoned under the Nazi policy of Sippenhaft, collective family punishment. The children were taken from their mother and given new identities, their original names erased from official records. Margareta von Oven, wife of conspirator Wessel Freitag von Loringhoven, was arrested while pregnant. She gave birth to her child in prison and was forced to give up the baby for adoption. She remained imprisoned until the war's end, never knowing if her child survived. The persecution extended to distant relatives and family friends. The wife of conspirator Berthold von Stauffenberg, Klaus's brother, was arrested despite having no knowledge of the plot. Their children were also taken into custody and placed in Nazi institutions designed to erase their family identity. The economic destruction was equally systematic. The properties of conspirators were confiscated, their bank accounts seized, and their businesses dissolved. Entire family lines were impoverished overnight, their ancestral estates converted to Nazi use or destroyed entirely. Even those who escaped immediate execution faced prolonged torture designed to extract information about other potential conspirators. Karl Gebhardt, designated as the future chancellor in the post-Hitler government, was arrested in August 1944. For months, he was subjected to interrogation designed to identify other resistance members. His eventual execution in February 1945 came only after he had been forced to provide information that led to dozens of additional arrests. The judicial murders continued well into 1945, even as Germany faced imminent defeat. Judge Freisler himself was killed in an Allied bombing raid in February 1945, But the executions continued under other judges. The last July 20th conspirator was executed just days before Germany's surrender. By the time the purge ended, the German officer corps had been decimated. Experienced generals who might have conducted a more effective defense of Germany had been eliminated, their knowledge and leadership lost to paranoid retribution. The very plot intended to save Germany from destruction instead hastened its defeat by removing many of its most capable military leaders. The systematic nature of the persecution revealed the true character of the Nazi regime. This wasn't merely punishment for treason, but an attempt to eliminate an entire class of potential opposition. The message was clear. Not just active resistance, but even the capacity for resistance would be met with annihilation. Yet the conspirators achieved a form of victory through their sacrifice. Their courage inspired resistance movements across occupied Europe and provided a moral foundation for post-war German redemption. But the immediate cost of their failed attempt was measured in thousands of lives and the destruction of countless families. The July 20th plot represented both the highest expression of German resistance to Hitler and the most devastating example of Nazi retribution against that resistance. The Nazi response to assassination attempts extended far beyond the immediate conspirators, creating a system of collective punishment that terrorized entire communities and families. This strategy of Sippenhaft, holding family members responsible for individual crimes, became one of the most effective tools of Nazi terror. Children of conspirators faced particularly cruel fates. They were separated from surviving family members and placed in Nazi institutions designed to erase their identities completely. The Stauffenberg children were separated and given new identities after their father's execution. The youngest, born after Klaus von Stauffenberg's death, grew up not knowing his father's name or circumstances of his birth. Women connected to conspirators were imprisoned in concentration camps, specifically for political prisoners' families. The economic warfare was equally systematic. Properties were confiscated from extended families, businesses dissolved, and bank accounts frozen. Entire family lines were reduced to poverty overnight. Professional destruction extended throughout German society. Teachers, doctors, and lawyers with any connection to conspirators found their careers destroyed. Medical licenses were revoked, teaching positions eliminated, and legal practices dissolved. The regime understood that professional destruction often proved more devastating than physical punishment. Religious communities faced systematic persecution following assassination attempts. Churches that provided moral support to resistors were closed, their leaders arrested, and congregations dispersed. Even seemingly innocent associations like bridge clubs and hiking groups faced investigation if members were connected to assassination attempts. The documentation reveals the bureaucratic efficiency of Nazi terror. Detailed records were kept of every arrest, property confiscation, and family separation. This wasn't random violence, but systematic destruction administered with governmental efficiency. The system was so effective that it continued functioning even as Germany faced defeat. Right up until the final days of the war, families connected to assassination attempts continued facing persecution, even when it served no strategic purpose. But the resistance continued, despite the horrific costs, leading to even more desperate attempts as the war neared its end. As Germany's military situation deteriorated in late 1944 and early 1945, assassination attempts against Hitler became increasingly desperate. The conspirators knew that failure would mean not just their own deaths, but the systematic destruction of their families and associates. Yet the urgency of ending the war drove individuals to attempt what seemed impossible, killing the most heavily guarded man in a collapsing empire. One of the final significant attempts came from young officer Eberhard von Breitenbach, who served as aide-de-camp to Field Marshal Busch. In March 1945, Breitenbach planned to shoot Hitler during a military briefing at the Berghof. Unlike the elaborate schemes of earlier plots, this was a simple plan born of desperation. Walk into Hitler's presence with a concealed pistol and fire at point-blank range. The attempt never materialized due to a last-minute security change that prevented him from entering the briefing room. His failure to act might have saved his life, as the investigation following the July 20th plot had made Hitler's security apparatus hyper-vigilant about potential threats from within his own military staff. The fate of those involved in these final attempts was particularly brutal because they occurred when the Nazi regime's survival instincts were at their most desperate. With the war clearly lost, Hitler's inner circle focused their remaining energy on eliminating any potential challenges to their authority during Germany's final collapse. Captain Axel von dem Busche, who had planned an earlier attempt that was cancelled due to circumstances beyond his control, represented the tragic fate of many would-be assassins. Though he survived the war, his involvement in resistance activities led to the persecution of his family members and the destruction of his ancestral estate. His story illustrates how even failed attempts that never materialized still carried devastating consequences for the conspirators' loved ones. The systematic nature of Nazi retribution meant that even those who merely considered resistance faced potential destruction. Hans von Dohnanyi, a lawyer who had been involved in resistance planning but never participated in actual assassination attempts, was arrested in 1943 and subjected to years of imprisonment and torture. His eventual execution in April 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, demonstrated the regime's determination to eliminate potential opponents, even when such actions served no strategic purpose. The final months of the war saw an acceleration of executions as Nazi leadership realized their time was limited. Concentration camps and prisons were systematically cleared of political prisoners, including many connected to assassination attempts. This represented a final act of spite. If the regime couldn't survive, it would ensure that its opponents didn't either. The destruction extended to documentary evidence as well, with Nazi officials destroying records of their persecution in the war's final weeks, attempting to eliminate evidence of their crimes. Some conspirators managed to escape the final purges through Allied liberation of concentration camps and prisons. These survivors often discovered they were among the few remaining members of their families, their relatives having been eliminated during years of systematic persecution. The psychological impact of survival was often as devastating as death itself, carrying guilt about surviving when so many others had perished. This survivor's guilt was compounded by the knowledge that their resistance activities had led to the deaths of family members who had no involvement in their plots. The courage of those who attempted to assassinate Hitler ultimately achieved a form of moral victory. Their willingness to sacrifice not just their own lives, but to risk the destruction of everyone they loved, provided a foundation for German moral rehabilitation after the war. Their example demonstrated that even under the most extreme totalitarian conditions, individual conscience could still assert itself against evil. The fate of those who tried to assassinate Hitler reveals the true nature of totalitarian power. The Nazi regime didn't simply eliminate its opponents, it destroyed them completely, along with their families, friends, and anyone who might carry forward their memory. From Georg Elser's solitary resistance to the elaborate military conspiracy of July 20th, each assassination attempt triggered waves of retribution that extended far beyond the actual conspirators. The systematic persecution, collective punishment, family destruction, elimination of social networks demonstrates how totalitarian regimes use terror not just to punish opposition, but to prevent it from ever emerging. The courage of these individuals becomes remarkable when we understand the full cost of their resistance. They knew failure would mean not just their own deaths, but the destruction of everyone they loved. Yet they acted anyway, driven by moral conviction that transcended personal safety. Their sacrifice provided the foundation for Germany's post-war moral rehabilitation and demonstrated that even under extreme totalitarian conditions, individual conscience could still assert itself against evil. The story of Hitler's would-be assassins serves as both inspiration and warning. Their courage reminds us that resistance to tyranny is always possible, but their fate reveals the true cost of that resistance. The fate of those captured while trying to get rid of Hitler was terrible, but it pales in comparison to what happened to those who fell into the hands of Nazi doctors. Deep in the Bavarian Alps, at Dachau concentration camp, Dr. Sigmund Rascher conducted experiments that would make even seasoned investigators recoil. Unlike Mengelé's twin studies, Rascher focused on what the Luftwaffe called high-altitude research, a clinical term that masked unthinkable brutality. Rascher had joined the SS in 1939, driven by both scientific ambition and ideological fervor. Born into a middle-class Bavarian family, he had originally pursued medicine with seemingly noble intentions, specializing in aviation medicine at a time when flight was still considered miraculous. His early research focused on legitimate questions about human physiology at high altitudes, work that could have saved lives and advanced scientific understanding. But somewhere along the way, Rascher's scientific curiosity became twisted into something far darker. His background in aviation medicine made him invaluable to the Nazi war effort, but it was his complete lack of human empathy that made him truly dangerous. Colleagues who knew him before the war described a gradual transformation from dedicated researcher to cold-blooded experimenter, as if his humanity had been systematically stripped away. The doctor constructed a mobile decompression chamber, designed to simulate the conditions pilots faced at extreme altitudes. But instead of using volunteers or animal subjects, Rascher used prisoners from Dachau. Men were sealed inside the chamber as air pressure was rapidly reduced, mimicking the experience of ejecting from aircraft at 40,000 feet without proper equipment. The results were predictably horrific. Subjects experienced violent convulsions as nitrogen bubbles formed in their bloodstream. Their lungs collapsed, blood vessels burst, and many lost consciousness within minutes. Some prisoners clawed desperately at the chamber walls as pressure dropped, their survival instincts overriding rational thought. Others remained eerily calm, perhaps understanding that resistance was futile. Rascher meticulously documented every stage of their suffering, noting how long it took for different individuals to lose motor function, experience cardiac arrest, or die. He recorded which ethnic groups seemed to survive longer, which age ranges showed greater resistance, and which physical conditions affected survival rates. His notes read like technical manuals, devoid of any acknowledgement that he was documenting human death. What made Rascher's experiments particularly disturbing was their systematic nature. He didn't conduct these procedures in moments of rage or panic. Each session was carefully planned and executed with scientific precision. He maintained detailed records, complete with photographs and physiological measurements, treating human death as merely another data point. The Luftwaffe was eager for this research. German pilots were flying at increasingly dangerous altitudes, and military commanders needed to understand the limits of human survival. Rascher's experiments provided valuable intelligence about oxygen deprivation, pressure changes, and emergency procedures. The Nazi war machine consumed this knowledge without questioning its source. But Rascher's ambitions extended beyond altitude research. He began conducting freezing experiments, submerging prisoners in ice water for hours to study hypothermia. The goal was to develop better survival techniques for German aircrew shot down over the North Sea or Arctic regions. The military application seemed logical. German pilots were increasingly flying missions over cold waters, and survival data could theoretically save lives. Prisoners were forced into tanks of freezing water, sometimes naked, sometimes in flight suits. The water temperature was carefully controlled, usually maintained just above freezing to prolong the dying process. Rascher monitored their core body temperature as it dropped, recording the exact moment when different organs began shutting down. Some subjects were kept alive through the entire process, experiencing the full progression from violent shivering to unconsciousness to cardiac arrest. The psychological torture was as systematic as the physical suffering. Rascher would often explain to prisoners exactly what was happening to their bodies as hypothermia set in, describing how their blood was being redirected away from extremities, how their brain function was deteriorating, and how long they could expect to survive. This clinical narration seemed to satisfy some twisted educational impulse while maximizing the victim's psychological distress. The doctor tried various rewarming techniques on those who survived the initial freezing. Some were placed under heat lamps, others immersed in warm baths, and still others were subjected to what he called human rewarming, forced contact with other prisoners. Each method was tested multiple times to establish statistical significance. Rascher's meticulous documentation reveals the chilling intersection of scientific methodology and human cruelty. His reports read like standard medical journals, complete with charts, graphs, and peer-reviewed conclusions. Yet every data point represented someone's final moments of agony. What makes Rascher's story even more disturbing is how ordinary he appeared. Colleagues described him as quiet and methodical, someone who approached his work with the same dedication as any researcher. He had a wife and children, maintained friendships, and participated in normal social activities. The man who could calmly observe prisoners freeze to death was the same person who sent birthday cards to relatives. The Nazi hierarchy rewarded Rascher's research generously. He received promotions, funding, and recognition from senior SS officials who praised his contributions to German aviation safety. Heinrich Himmler personally commended his work, noting how valuable the findings would be for protecting German soldiers. But Rascher's scientific pursuits masked deeper psychological problems that would eventually lead to his downfall. His obsession with human experimentation began extending into increasingly bizarre territories, setting the stage for even more disturbing revelations about his character. And speaking of disturbing revelations, our next doctor took the concept of medical ethics and completely inverted it, turning recovery into systematic destruction in ways that still shock researchers today. Dr. Karl Gebhardt embodied the terrifying potential of medical knowledge weaponized against humanity. As Heinrich Himmler's personal physician and one of Germany's most respected orthopedic surgeons, Gebhardt used his position to conduct experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. Unlike other Nazi doctors who worked in relative obscurity, Gebhardt operated at the highest levels of German society. He treated prominent Nazi officials, lectured at prestigious medical schools, and maintained a thriving private practice in Berlin. His patient list included some of the most powerful figures in the Third Reich, who trusted him with their health while remaining completely unaware of his secret activities. Gebhardt's reputation as a skilled surgeon provided perfect cover for his secret research activities. He was known throughout Germany as an innovator in orthopedic surgery, someone who had developed new techniques for treating complex bone and joint injuries. Medical journals regularly published his research, and younger doctors sought training under his supervision. This legitimate professional success made his criminal activities all the more shocking. Gebhardt's most notorious experiments took place at Ravensbrück concentration camp, where he focused on what he called wound healing research. The SS had commissioned studies on treating battlefield injuries, particularly infected wounds that weren't responding to standard treatment. Gebhardt saw an opportunity to advance both his career and Nazi military medicine. The doctor selected healthy prisoners, primarily Polish women political prisoners, for his experiments. These women had been arrested for resistance activities, minor infractions, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Many were educated, professional women who had been leading normal lives before their arrest. Gebhardt deliberately chose healthy subjects because diseased or malnourished prisoners would compromise his experimental results. He deliberately inflicted wounds on their legs, then introduced various infectious agents to simulate battlefield conditions. The wounds were created using surgical instruments, ensuring consistent size and depth for scientific accuracy. Some wounds were infected with streptococcus, others with gas gangrene, and still others with tetanus. Each infection was carefully cultivated in laboratory conditions to ensure maximum virulence. What made Gebhardt's approach particularly sinister was his systematic methodology. He divided subjects into control groups, treating some with experimental medications, while others received no treatment at all. This wasn't battlefield medicine. It was carefully controlled scientific research using human beings as laboratory animals. The infections Gebhardt introduced were often fatal if left untreated. Prisoners developed high fevers, severe pain, and progressive tissue death as bacteria consumed healthy muscle and bone. Many lost the ability to walk as infections spread through their legs, causing permanent disability even when they survived. Gebhardt meticulously documented the progression of each infection, photographing wounds at different stages and recording detailed notes about symptoms, treatment responses, and outcomes. His research generated hundreds of pages of medical data, all based on deliberately inflicted suffering. The doctor tested various treatment approaches, including experimental sulfonamide drugs that showed promise in treating bacterial infections. Some prisoners received standard doses, others received concentrated versions, and still others were given placebos to serve as control subjects. Gebhardt treated their pain and recovery as variables to be manipulated, rather than human experiences to be respected. What distinguished Gebhardt from other Nazi doctors was his integration into mainstream German medicine. He continued practicing normal orthopedic surgery while conducting his experiments, moving seamlessly between treating paying patients and torturing prisoners. Colleagues who worked with him had no idea about his double life. The results of Gebhardt's research were presented at medical conferences throughout Germany. He published papers in respected journals, describing his findings without mentioning that the data came from deliberate human experimentation. The German medical establishment unknowingly built upon research generated through systematic torture. Gebhardt's experiments expanded beyond wound infections as the war progressed. He began studying bone transplantation, removing healthy bone segments from prisoners, and attempting to graft them into other subjects. These procedures were conducted without proper anesthesia, causing excruciating pain that lasted for weeks. The bone experiments served multiple purposes for Nazi ideology. Beyond their potential military applications, they supported theories about racial differences in healing and recovery. Gebhardt compared how different ethnic groups responded to surgical procedures, collecting data that was later used to justify discriminatory medical policies. His transplantation research also included nerve regeneration studies. Gebhardt severed major nerves in prisoners' limbs, then attempted various repair techniques to restore function. Most subjects were left with permanent paralysis, but the doctor continued refining his methods through repeated trials on new victims. The scope of Gebhardt's research revealed the systematic nature of Nazi medical crimes. This wasn't opportunistic brutality. It was organized scientific inquiry conducted within established institutional frameworks. The same hospitals, universities, and research facilities that provided legitimate medical care also supported systematic human experimentation. Gebhardt's work received substantial funding and resources from both military and civilian sources. The German Research Foundation provided grants for his studies, while pharmaceutical companies supplied experimental medications for testing. The entire German scientific establishment became complicit in his crimes through bureaucratic participation. But Gebhardt's experiments were just one component of a much larger medical apparatus that perverted healing into systematic harm. Our next doctor took this corruption to its logical extreme, turning medical care itself into an instrument of elimination. Dr. August Hirt represents perhaps the most chilling example of how academic respectability can mask unthinkable cruelty. As head of anatomy at the University of Strasbourg, Hirt transformed legitimate scientific research into systematic collection of human remains for ideological purposes. Hirt's background appeared impeccable by academic standards. He held advanced degrees from prestigious German universities, published extensively in anatomical journals, and maintained an active research program that earned respect from colleagues across Europe. Students described him as an engaging lecturer who brought passion and expertise to his teaching. But beneath this academic facade, Hirt harbored beliefs that would transform him into one of Nazi Germany's most disturbing figures. He became obsessed with creating what he called a complete collection of human anatomical specimens that would support Nazi theories about racial hierarchy and genetic superiority. Traditional anatomical collections relied on bodies donated for medical education or acquired through legal means. Hirt found these sources inadequate for his purposes. He wanted fresh specimens from living subjects, collected under controlled conditions that would preserve specific physiological characteristics. Existing collections, he argued, were too random and poorly documented to support the kind of systematic racial research he envisioned. Working with Heinrich Himmler and other SS leadership, Hirt developed a systematic program for acquiring human specimens from concentration camps. His requests were specific and detailed. He needed subjects of particular ethnic backgrounds, age ranges, and physical characteristics to complete his collection. These requests were treated as routine administrative matters, processed through normal SS bureaucratic channels alongside requisitions for supplies and equipment. The process Hirt developed was methodically organized. Selected prisoners were transported from various camps to a facility near Strasbourg, where they underwent extensive measurements and photography before being killed. Their bodies were then processed using techniques Hirt had perfected for preserving anatomical specimens. What made Hirt's collection unique was its scope and organization. Unlike other Nazi doctors who focused on specific experiments, Hirt was building a comprehensive database of human variation that would serve researchers for generations. He envisioned his collection becoming the foundation for an entire academic discipline devoted to racial classification. The killing methods Hirt employed were chosen for their ability to preserve specimen quality, rather than any consideration for reducing suffering. Subjects were killed using techniques that maintained blood circulation until the moment of death, ensuring that organs and tissues remained in optimal condition for study. Hirt maintained detailed records for each specimen, including photographs, measurements, personal histories, and circumstances of death. These files were organized like library catalogs, allowing researchers to quickly locate specimens with particular characteristics for comparative studies. The University of Strasbourg provided full institutional support for Hirt's research. The university allocated laboratory space, purchased specialized equipment, and assigned graduate students to assist with specimen processing. Academic administrators treated the collection as a prestigious research asset that enhanced the university's reputation. Hirt's work attracted attention from anatomists throughout Germany, and occupied Europe. Visiting researchers came to study his specimens, writing papers based on their observations and citing his collection in their publications. The academic community unknowingly became complicit in legitimizing systematic murder. The collection grew rapidly as Hirt expanded his criteria for acquisition. Beyond ethnic classification research, he began collecting specimens for studies of occupational health, genetic disorders, and physiological variation. Each new research question required additional victims with specific characteristics. What distinguished Hirt's operation was its integration into normal academic processes. Graduate students wrote dissertations based on the collection. Professors incorporated specimen studies into their courses, and researchers published their findings in legitimate journals. The entire academic enterprise continued functioning while being fundamentally corrupted. Hirt also developed relationships with pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers who were interested in his research. These partnerships provided additional funding and resources while creating commercial applications for knowledge generated through systematic murder. The psychological impact on those who worked with Hirt's collection varied considerably. Some assistants and students seemed genuinely unaware of how specimens were acquired, focusing solely on their scientific value. Others clearly understood the collection's origins, but justified their participation through appeals to scientific advancement. Hirt himself appeared to experience no moral conflict about his work. Colleagues described him as enthusiastic and dedicated, someone who approached specimen collection with the same passion other researchers brought to library research or field studies. He seemed genuinely proud of his collection's comprehensiveness and scientific potential. As the war progressed, Hirt's ambitions expanded beyond simple specimen collection. He began developing plans for a comprehensive research institute that would use his collection as the foundation for systematic studies of human variation, genetic inheritance, and racial classification. But even Hirt's systematic approach to human collection pales in comparison to our final doctor, whose work revealed the true depths of medical corruption possible when ethical constraints completely disappear. Dr. Aribert Heim earned the nickname Dr. Death through methods so brutal that even other SS doctors found his techniques disturbing. Working primarily at Mauthausen concentration camp, Heim transformed medical treatment into systematic torture that served no scientific or military purpose beyond satisfying his apparent sadistic impulses. Unlike other Nazi doctors who justified their experiments through appeals to scientific advancement or military necessity, Heim's activities seemed motivated by pure cruelty. He used his medical training not to conduct organized research, but to inflict maximum suffering on prisoners who came to him seeking help. There were no research protocols, no data collection beyond personal satisfaction, and no apparent scientific goals beyond exploring the limits of human endurance. Heim's approach to medicine inverted every principle of healing. Prisoners who reported to the camp infirmary with minor ailments often died within hours of encountering him. Those seeking treatment for infections, injuries, or illness discovered that medical attention under Heim's care was more dangerous than their original conditions. The infirmary, traditionally a place of refuge and recovery, became a chamber of terror under his supervision. His reputation spread throughout Mauthausen with terrifying efficiency. Prisoners learned to recognize his voice, his footsteps, and even his silhouette from a distance. They developed elaborate systems for avoiding the infirmary when he was on duty, preferring to endure serious medical conditions rather than risk encountering him. Some prisoners died from treatable conditions rather than seek help that might bring them to Heim's attention. The doctor developed injection techniques that were designed to cause prolonged agony rather than quick death. He experimented with various chemicals and compounds, testing their effects on conscious subjects who were fully aware of what was happening to them. These weren't medical treatments. They were systematic torture sessions disguised as healthcare. What made Heim particularly dangerous was his medical knowledge. He understood human anatomy and physiology well enough to keep subjects alive and conscious throughout procedures that would normally cause immediate unconsciousness or death. His technical expertise extended the duration and intensity of suffering he could inflict. Heim's methods included injections directly into the heart that caused extended cardiac distress, chemical compounds that induced severe organ pain, and surgical procedures performed without anesthesia that maximized trauma while keeping subjects conscious. Each technique seemed calculated to produce maximum suffering over the longest possible duration. Witnesses described Heim as appearing genuinely excited during these procedures. Unlike other Nazi doctors who maintained clinical detachment during their experiments, Heim seemed to derive personal satisfaction from observing pain and fear. His behavior suggested psychological motivations that went far beyond ideological commitment. The doctor kept detailed records of his procedures, but these documents focused on subjective observations about suffering rather than objective medical data. His notes described victims' reactions, the duration of their agony, and his assessments of their psychological state during torture. Heim's activities at Mauthausen created a climate of terror that extended far beyond his direct victims. Prisoners throughout the camp learned to avoid the infirmary at all costs, preferring to endure serious medical conditions rather than risk encountering him. The promise of medical care became a threat rather than hope. What distinguished Heim's approach was its apparently random nature. While other Nazi doctors selected subjects based on research criteria or ideological categories, Heim seemed to choose victims based on opportunity and personal whim. Any prisoner who came within his reach could become a target for his particular brand of medical torture. The doctor's techniques evolved over time as he discovered new methods for inflicting suffering. He developed injection protocols that caused specific types of organ failure, surgical approaches that maximized trauma, and chemical combinations that produced particular psychological effects. Each innovation made his methods more sophisticated and more brutal. Heim also experimented with timing and duration, studying how long subjects could endure various procedures before losing consciousness or dying. These observations weren't recorded for scientific purposes, but seemed to reflect his personal interest in understanding the limits of human suffering. His behavior affected other medical personnel at Mauthausen as well. Nurses and orderlies who worked with Heim described feeling sick and disturbed by his methods, but few were willing to challenge someone with his authority and connections within the SS hierarchy. The systematic nature of Heim's cruelty revealed something important about the Nazi medical system. It wasn't just that doctors abandoned their ethical obligations. The entire institutional framework encouraged and rewarded behavior that violated every principle of human decency. After the war, Heim managed to escape prosecution and lived freely for decades under assumed identities. His ability to evade justice highlighted the challenges of holding Nazi war criminals accountable and the limitations of post-war efforts to address medical crimes. The stories of these four doctors, Rascher, Gebhardt, Hirt, and Heim, represent just a fraction of the medical professionals who abandoned their oath to heal and became instruments of systematic cruelty. Their crimes weren't aberrations committed by a few disturbed individuals, but products of a system that corrupted an entire profession. Each represents a different path toward the same destination: the complete abandonment of medical ethics in service of ideology, ambition, or sadistic impulse. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is how they reveal the vulnerability of medical ethics when institutional protections disappear. Doctors who had spent years learning to heal became agents of harm when social constraints and professional oversight were removed. The same knowledge that should have been used to preserve life was perverted into sophisticated methods of causing death and suffering. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Each of these men had moments of choice, opportunities to step back from the precipice of evil. Yet they continued down their chosen paths, finding ways to justify increasingly horrific actions. Some claimed scientific necessity, others cited military requirements, and still others seemed to abandon justification entirely in favor of pure sadism. The Nazi medical crimes demonstrate how quickly scientific methodology can be perverted when moral boundaries collapse. The same skills used to advance human health were redirected toward systematic torture and elimination, showing that technical expertise without ethical grounding becomes dangerous rather than beneficial. Research protocols, statistical analysis, and peer review, all hallmarks of legitimate science, were used to legitimize systematic murder. These doctors operated within established institutions, universities, hospitals, and research centers that provided legitimacy and resources for their crimes. The corruption extended beyond individual practitioners to encompass entire organizational structures that supported and rewarded systematic human experimentation. Academic administrators, research funding agencies, and professional journals all became complicit in legitimizing atrocities. Perhaps most chilling is how ordinary these men appeared to their contemporaries. They maintained families, friendships, and professional relationships while conducting some of the most disturbing experiments in human history. Their ability to compartmentalize extreme cruelty with normal social functioning reveals disturbing truths about human psychology and the capacity for moral disconnection. The legacy of Nazi medical crimes continues influencing modern bioethics, research protocols, and professional standards. Contemporary medical education emphasizes ethical training precisely because history shows how easily technical knowledge can be misused when moral frameworks fail. International research guidelines, informed consent requirements, and institutional review boards all exist as safeguards against repeating these historical horrors. Understanding these stories isn't just about historical documentation. It's about recognizing warning signs that could emerge in any society where institutional protections weaken and professional ethics become subordinated to political ideology or personal ambition. The gradual erosion of ethical standards, the subordination of individual welfare to collective goals, and the dehumanization of targeted populations all contributed to creating conditions where respected professionals could become systematic killers. The doctors we've discussed today committed crimes that violated every principle of human decency, yet they operated within systems that rewarded their behavior and legitimized their actions. Their stories serve as permanent reminders of what happens when healing becomes corrupted into systematic harm, and why eternal vigilance is necessary to protect the integrity of medical practice.